Are you ready to fight that for years? To rot in prison for life? We know what happened in there, Daniel, and we know those records won't save you.
But I didn't do anything. I was inside.
Enough. We don't care about the records. Say what we want to hear. Now, you can end this nightmare right now. Tell us you were out there with the other kids. Then this is over. I'm offering you a way out, Daniel. Your last chance.
Okay, I'll say whatever you want to hear.
When the guards first brought Daniel Taylor into a room at Stateville Prison outside Chicago, the journalist and the inmate did not know each other. The year was 2001. The journalist was then a reporter for a Chicago-based newspaper. Taylor was an inmate serving a life sentence. Taylor had written to the journalist earlier. It was one of about a dozen letters the journalist received each month from inmates, each tucked inside an envelope with a red stamp notation from the Illinois Department of Corrections, as if to warn the recipient about its contents. But his letter was different. He wrote that he had been convicted of 2 murders committed in 1992. But he had records showing he was in a lockup cell at a police station when the murders occurred. Even in Chicago, which was rapidly gaining a reputation for miscarriages of justice, the situation was shocking. Over more than a decade, the journalist spoke with Taylor repeatedly on the phone. The journalist visited him in prison. And along with colleagues, the journalist investigated his case as part of a series of stories on false confessions, and then followed it until he was exonerated in June 2013. It took nearly 2 decades for Taylor to be exonerated and freed, which spoke to many things, but most importantly to the frailties of the criminal justice system and Taylor's relentless tenacity. Taylor had a kindness and candor that the journalist liked immediately. He was open about his troubled childhood spent in foster homes and shelters, dropping out of school, and life on the streets. He had joined the Vice Lord Street Gang about 3 months before the murders, largely because his friends were in it. He'd been arrested a few times for minor offenses like gang action and theft. Over the years, the journalist and Taylor got to know each other better. More than anything, the journalist admired his tenacity in the face of a justice system that repeatedly rejected his claims of innocence. That persistence was another sign to the journalist that he might be innocent, but the facts of the case were most important. This week, the Chicago City Council approved a $14.25 million wrongful conviction settlement for Taylor, ending an odyssey that began 3 decades ago. His journey should have been much shorter. After all, Taylor, who was 17 at the time, had the best alibi imaginable. When Jeffrey Lassiter and Sharon Hoggabook were shot and killed in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood on November 16, 1992, Taylor was locked up at a nearby police station. He had been arrested for fighting 2 hours before the murders and was released more than an hour after the murders. The police department's own records and statements from officers working the lockup showed that Taylor was in police custody at the time. But by the time police found these records, they had already built the case against him. 2 other young men had been picked up and, after confessing to being lookouts, implicated Taylor and others. In all, 8 young black men were charged with the murders. Taylor confessed, too. He said he had decided resistance was futile after detectives hit him with a flashlight and told him he could leave if he said what they wanted to hear. He ultimately gave a long statement. In it, he said that he and others had killed Lassiter and Hoggabook, with 4 committing the crime and 4 others acting as lookouts. The other young men confessed as well, implicating each other, which ultimately led to 5 being sent to state prison. Cases against 3 of the 8 collapsed at various stages. Some of the others also said they had been abused. Police repeatedly denied doing anything wrong in any of the cases. In Chicago, as in other places, confessions are powerful evidence, and people find it hard to understand how someone could confess to a crime they didn't commit. But it happens with disturbing frequency. Once a confession is made, it is nearly impossible for law enforcement to move away from that narrative. Police and prosecutors have pursued cases even when DNA evidence excluded a defendant and pointed to another suspect. They have pursued cases even when the confession didn't match physical evidence. And they have pursued cases, in addition to Taylor's, where the suspect was in custody at the time the crime was committed. So many questionable confessions have occurred in Chicago, including false confessions obtained through torture by former Commander John Burge and his detectives, which have led to tens of millions of dollars in settlements. that criminal justice advocates have called the city the false confession capital. Taylor's case upends the idealistic notion that injustices, especially seemingly more obvious ones, will be quickly corrected. It shatters the idea that when evidence emerges to undercut the theory of a case, the facts will be aggressively and thoroughly re-examined to ensure the right people are tried and imprisoned, that there will be an honest reckoning to right the wrongs of those who were unjustly harmed, and that a legal fight, as so many people experience, will ensue. When Taylor went to trial in 1995, prosecutors questioned his alibi. They argued the records showing him behind bars were unreliable, essentially arguing that their own documents and employees could not be trusted. They presented witnesses who said they saw Taylor on the streets while he was supposedly in custody. Taylor was convicted at 19 and sentenced to life in prison. The two other men who confessed were also sentenced to life, while the other two were given 30 years. While the journalist and colleagues investigated Taylor's case, they found plenty of new evidence of his innocence, documents and witnesses that undermined the case against him. If Taylor's case collapsed, all the cases would, because they all relied on the confessions linking the young men to the crime. Following their investigation, prosecutors said they had reviewed the case again and were certain Taylor was guilty. Taylor was heartbroken. The journalist and colleagues were unsurprised. As Taylor languished in prison, the journalist and a colleague continued to report on the case for the next decade, growing increasingly troubled that the system refused to correct what appeared to be such an obvious wrong. They uncovered additional evidence pointing to his innocence. In 2003, one of the convicted men, the only one significantly older than the other 7, confessed that he was involved in the murders and that the others were not. Other witnesses were found. More exculpatory documents were uncovered. No one else was ever arrested for the murders. Taylor's attorneys said there was no indication that the investigation was reopened, and so events unfolded. Slowly accumulating evidence confirmed what had been clear all along. Daniel Taylor was innocent. At the same time, lawyers at the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University School of Law took on the case, compiling additional evidence over the years and building a powerful argument that there had been an unfair trial in court. In time, the case gained traction. The U.S. Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals wrote in 2011 that there was strong evidence that Taylor's participation in the crime was physically impossible. The Illinois Attorney General's office also became involved in the case, handing over records that Taylor's attorneys had not seen. Facing a life sentence, Taylor educated himself and studied his case, as many inmates do. He learned to play chess and lifted weights. He was doing what seemed impossible to the journalist, making a virtue out of necessity. But there were times he lost hope. He cried at night. At one point, he cut his wrist. His life felt defined by an injustice. They spoke every few weeks for years, but the journalist was never sure if their conversations offered him much hope or solace. Often, the journalist had no news to give him. Investigating wrongful conviction cases, some dating back decades, is slow, painstaking work. One can go months, even years, without any progress. And then, in 2013, prosecutors agreed to drop Taylor's conviction, saying a review of documents and interviews with additional witnesses convinced them that pursuing a case in this matter is not in the interests of justice. A cold piece of language that didn't reflect the legal fights the Cook County State's Attorney's Office had waged to keep Taylor behind bars. After spending more than half his life behind bars, Taylor, his beard now graying, walked out of Menard Correctional Center on a warm, sunny afternoon with $41 in his pocket. He walked into the embrace of his family. He was free. He rented an apartment. He found a job at Northwestern University, working in the shipping and receiving department. He became a father. In 2014, a judge gave him a certificate of innocence. Later that year, he filed suit, alleging that police arrested him knowing he was innocent. That set the stage for the legal battle that involved years of depositions and pleadings and finally ended in a settlement. Nearly 3 decades after his arrest, the city of Chicago will pay Taylor millions of dollars to compensate him for the years he lost in prison. A police spokesperson declined to comment. Jessica Felker, the city's deputy corporation counsel, told the Finance Committee last week that settling the case was a cost-effective measure to limit the city's risk. Felker noted that if the case went to trial, Taylor's lawyers could seek between $21 million and $42 million in damages, plus an additional $4 million in attorney's fees. By the time Taylor receives his compensation, the city will have paid out nearly $40 million to Taylor and 3 other men who were exonerated, a staggering sum for a case that looked questionable from the start. Police and prosecutors have never publicly disclosed whether any of the people who handled the investigation or prosecution were ever disciplined, and Taylor's attorneys found no evidence that anyone was held accountable. The journalists surmised that no one would ever be held accountable. David Owens, an attorney with the Chicago law firm Lovey and Lovey and one of Taylor's lawyers in the case, said in an interview, "The city of Chicago chose to fight and prolong this process rather than acknowledge that there was a great injustice here. They chose to maintain the position that Daniel was guilty." Owens noted that Taylor faced opposition at every stage. Even after a jury decided in 2017 to award $13.4 million to one of Taylor's co-defendants, and the city of Chicago agreed to pay $5.25 million to 2 other co-defendants, the city continued to fight Taylor's case. According to Felker, that fight cost the city government a high price, paying outside counsel more than $2 million. They saw Daniel as a defendant, not a traumatized person, Owens said. The journalist no longer had the first letter Taylor wrote to him. The journalist hadn't spoken to him for several years until this week. He had lawyers he had grown close to, including the late Karen Daniel from Northwestern, and the journalist didn't want to intrude on his freedom. He didn't want to remind him of his old life. He was building a new one. But with his case now settled, the time seemed right. They met at his lawyer's office on Monday and embraced. Though his small goatee was now more white than gray, he looked the same. At 46, he is focused on his 7-year-old son. He, his girlfriend, and his son plan to move away from Illinois, leaving behind the memories of his arrest, trial, and imprisonment. Taylor told the journalist he was largely at peace. He said he had moved past his anger that no one was ever held accountable for his wrongful conviction. Instead, he said, he chose to be excited about the future, about a chance to live a comfortable life, and give his son opportunities one didn't get to have. His life changed, but he knows the criminal justice system hasn't. "Mark my words," he said, "I won't be the last person proven innocent."